Galactic sentient broadcast. Target, planet Earth. Begin invasion in 3, 2, 1.
Greetings, invaders. My name is Scott. This is Book Invasion. Thanks for joining me. On today's episode, does science fiction make you stupid? Let's get into it. So there was a study done by two professors that was published in the Scientific Study of Literature in 2017. The professors were Chris Gavler and Dan Johnson, and they wanted to measure how identifying a text as science fiction automatically makes readers assume it's less worthwhile in a literary sense, and thus devote less time and less effort to reading it. The reason they did this study was because there was a 2013 study which found that literary fiction made readers more empathetic than genre fiction. The study was done and performed, and the results were published. And the headlines, there was a headline published in The Guardian which said, "Science fiction triggers poor reading, study finds," which then turns into, "Science fiction makes you stupid." From the opening of the paper, I'll read the first opening paragraph of this study, and then we'll kind of get into it. So the opening paragraph goes like this. Some purport that literary fiction is determined by high inference demand. Subgenre of science fiction is often defined by story world tropes that may reduce inferential demands. However, science fiction with high inference demands may also constitute literary fiction. Instead of inferential demands, it may be readers' responses to setting that distinguishes science fiction and narrative realism. In two experiments, a story was manipulated for contemporary and science fiction settings. Also, a version of each text with and without explanatory statements manipulated inference demand. Readers perceive the science fiction text as lower in literary quality. For science fiction, readers also exerted less inference effort for theory of mind, but more for understanding the world. Regardless of inference effort, participants who read the story in the science fiction world performed more poorly on comprehension. Readers' expectations triggered by setting tropes seem to be particularly potent determinants of literary quality perceptions, inference effort, and comprehension. What was that again? So what they did was they took a story, they turned it into what they call narrative realism, which is literary fiction, and just kind of put it out there. And then they added attributes and adjectives, setting, to turn that into a science fiction setting. So they had different groups of people read these stories side by side. One was narrative realism, the other was science fiction. And then they did narrative realism with theory of mind, which means that they explicitly state out what the character is thinking, to saying, Jim felt upset about this, or Jim knew that something was happening. So they put that what they call theory of mind into each of those and made those. So there's 4 different stories: narrative realism, science fiction, narrative realism with theory of mind, science fiction with theory of mind. And they took those 4 kind of pieces and sent them out to readers, and then they asked them questionnaires based on the stories that they read. And so, for example, the opening paragraphs of a narrative realism story would go like this. Jim takes a deep breath, bracing himself before pushing open the glass door. Miss Moyer glances at him once and then drops her eyes to her menu, which she continues reading with improbable intensity as Jim walks past her booth. Sally, a woman Jim dated back in high school, squeaks the heel of her sneaker as she pivots and vanishes into the shadows of the kitchen. An older waitress Jim doesn't know by name eventually plods over to his table, slaps the menu on the placemat without saying a word or glance, and then continues to the next booth where she chats and giggles for a full minute before taking orders. Narrative realism. Now, science fiction. It goes like this. Corporal Jones takes a deep breath, bracing himself before stepping through the airlock. Engineer Grady glances at him once and then drops her eyes to her mobile screen, which she continues reading with improbable intensity as Jones walks past her booth. Sally, a 4-armed Alpha Centurion Jones dated back at the academy, squeaks the heel of her anti-gravity boot as she pivots and vanishes into the shadow of the galley. An ensign on server duty, who Jim doesn't know by name, eventually plods over to his table, grudgingly projects a holographic menu over his placemat without a word or glance, and then continues to the next booth where she chats and giggles for a full minute before taking orders. See what they did there? So they took those 2 stories and they broke it down into different pieces of comprehension. The comprehension for the plot, the theory of mind. So as you have samples of people picked at random to read these two stories, I would infer that the comprehension of those who read the literary fiction and the narrative realism would be higher than those within science fiction, because when you get people reading science fiction who aren't fans of science fiction and that's not their thing, then they're going to read the science fiction story more poorly and not give it the attention that someone who is a science fiction fan would deserve. So therefore, when they got the results of these, they saw that of those who read science fiction, since it's not a universally relatable genre, it has those type of different buzzwords and things in it, that scored obviously lower than a narrative realism story, which is something that's present day. It's more based in reality. That kind of story obviously would get higher comprehension because they have things that are tangible and things that are real, characters that are feeling things and settings that are familiar, and so on and so forth. It is understandable that when you take a random sample of people without understanding what their genre preferences are, and you throw them into reading a sci-fi story, yeah, you're going to get people who just spite read it, and people who aren't going to give it that type of attention that people who do like science fiction would. And then when you're going to ask them questions about comprehending the story, they're going to just wing it and say it was just kind of a silly thing. The conclusion of the study was that 2 experiments examined the roles of genre and theory of mind explanations. A science fiction setting, in contrast to a realistic setting, decreased all extrinsic measures but plot effort reporting, which was unaffected, and theory of world effort reporting, which was either unaffected or increased. Results also showed that theory of mind explanations increased theory of mind comprehension, which means that if the story explains something and how someone is thinking, that's going to increase the people's understanding of that. While setting is not an intrinsic quality of literariness, setting can be a distinguishable quality of the subgenre science fiction, and it appears to predispose readers to a less effortful and comprehending mode of reading. Yeah, so when the science fiction setting is presenting to someone that doesn't expect it and doesn't like science fiction, they're not going to comprehend the story as well as someone who does, regardless of the actual intrinsic difficulty of the text. The low comprehension of science fiction is ameliorated by theory of mind explanations, which reduces difficulty by reducing inference demands and so arguably makes the text less literary. Future research should further examine the role of genre elements as inference in defining literariness. And so there was a quote from the author of the study, from the creator of the study, where he talks about this. And he says, "While this wouldn't be true of all readers, for those who are biased against sci-fi, thinking of it as an inferior genre of fiction, they assume the story will be less worthwhile, one that doesn't require or reward careful reading, and so they read less attentively. This then lowers their scores on objective comprehension tests because they miss so much. Interestingly, they do not even realize it because they still report that the story required less effort to understand. It's a self-fulfilling bias, except we can now show objectively that the weakness is with the reader, not the story itself. So, when readers are biased against science fiction, read the word airlock, their negative assumptions kick in. Oh, it's that kind of story. And they begin reading poorly. So no, science fiction doesn't really make you stupid. It's more that if you're stupid enough to be biased against science fiction, you will read science fiction stupidly." So after they did this study, and people answered the questions, what they found was that it's not that science fiction makes you dumb or read poorly. It's that for the people who read science fiction who don't like science fiction and they have some kind of bias against it, they think it's silly or not meaningful. Obviously, they're going to read the story, and as soon as they hear those type of words as airlocks and grav boots and stuff, they're going to say, "Oh, this doesn't really require heavy reading, and it's not doesn't have very good literary merit, so I'm not going to give it the attention that I think it deserves. I'm going to kind of skim some things and skip over some things." So yeah, there's going to be lower comprehension in those readers when they go up to a test and say, okay, so what did you feel about the characters? So the takeaway is that people who read literary fiction don't like to read science fiction. No, it's just that if you take science fiction, if you take a random sample of readers, say if I take all of BookTube and I put them into different categories and say this half is going to read literary fiction, this half is going to read science fiction, and not just at random. Now, the people I put in the science fiction pool aren't always all going to like science fiction, and they're going to think it's silly, and they're not going to take the time to study the text as they would for people who do like science fiction. So when they're going to get a comprehension test, they're going to say, I don't know, I wasn't paying attention, and then. But if you take the people who are science fiction fans and you put them in a literary fiction world, I think that translates a little bit better, because literary fiction is more universally understood, and it's more comprehensible in ways, in verses and things like that. I think that's the case. So don't worry, everybody. Science fiction doesn't make you stupid. It's just if you're stupid enough not to like science fiction, then you will read science fiction stupidly. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like more, be sure to like and subscribe. I will see you guys next time. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. See ya. Bye-bye. Greetings, invaders. It's me again, future me, to tell you, as I was editing and preparing this video, I found a follow-up that's only 8 months old that says sci-fi makes you stupid study refuted by scientists behind original research. The subheadline is, after finding readers devoted less attention to science fiction than literary fiction, researchers say quality determines comprehension, not genre. So it's okay, everybody. We're not stupid. We're not getting stupid. It's the quality. It goes on to say that the authors of a 2017 study, which found that science fiction, quote, makes you stupid, have conducted a follow-up that found that it's only bad sci-fi that has this effect. A well-written slice of sci-fi will be read just as thoroughly as a literary story. Hey. It turns out our first study didn't reveal much about sci-fi generally, but about what we would now have to call, quote, non-literary sci-fi. The text we use for our new study instead, quote, literary sci-fi, and it didn't trigger poor reading at all. Not even when it was introduced with a paragraph describing the story as non-literary. Readers basically ignored that intro and engaged actively with the text itself anyway. He said, I assume there were plenty of readers in the sample groups who didn't like sci-fi, but it didn't matter because they still responded to the literary qualities of the story. Their comprehension didn't drop this time. I'm hopeful that it will once and for all give definitive evidence that literary fiction and genre fiction, specifically science fiction, are not separate categories, said Cavalier. So yeah, that goes back to the original study where they studied literary fiction and science fiction, but now instead of just throwing in science fiction terms into a story and not improving the overall quality, if they combine those two and turn something into literary fiction and literary science fiction, they didn't see a decrease in scores. So only quote bad sci-fi. It's the quality of the story itself. So is there a difference between then bad sci-fi and literary sci-fi and regular sci-fi? You tell me. I suppose there would be. That if you were to take a sample group of people and show them literary fiction and then another sample and show them like a literary science fiction book, would they both score the same in comprehension studies? Probably. But if you take a literary fiction and then throw in just some garbage science fiction that throws in just airlocks and grav boots and four-armed people just at random intervals, that doesn't make it a good story. That does kind of distract from the comprehension of the story itself. So yeah, so concluding their original study, which just took a story and threw in sci-fi elements of it, they really kind of composed a brand new story that was more of a literary sci-fi and kind of swirled it in. Instead of just throwing in, instead of door, he said airlock. Instead of shoes, they wrote grav boots and so on. It doesn't make it a good sci-fi story for people to really care about it. But if you take that element and you twist it into kind of a literary setting, you beef it up a little bit more, then yes, people will comprehend and be more engaged in it than they would be otherwise. So I think that's a good refutal of the study. I'm glad I kind of found this and dug this up because, yeah, I don't think it's a solid claim that reading sci-fi makes you stupid. I think it's just the quality of the science fiction, that the stories in the original study weren't really up to snuff as far as how you want people to interpret them. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you later. Bye-bye.